So what is emotional intelligence? It's not a buzzword. By definition, emotional intelligence is the ability to recognize, understand, and manage our emotions, but it's also the ability to recognize, understand, and influence the emotions of others. So emotional intelligence was first defined by Dr. Peter Salovey. He's the current president of Yale University. And Dr. John Mayer, no, not the hit-making guitar player. Became to be popularized by Daniel Goleman. His eponymous book, Emotional Intelligence, came out in the mid-90s. And that's really what took emotional intelligence into the stratosphere and into what we know today as one of the big leadership parts and components of what is so important. And one of the reasons why it's so important, research has shown, and Dr. Travis Bradberry, who wrote the book Emotional Intelligence 2.0, after Daniel Goleman, of course. Research from multiple different sources and all of the academic grounding that he had went on to show that emotional intelligence is the biggest predictor of long-term success in the workplace out of any other skill. So let me say that again and think about that. Emotional intelligence is the biggest predictor of long-term success in the workplace, more than any other skill. And so their point, and Dr. Travis Bradberry's point, was that IQ in many instances is what's going to get your butt in the seat, right? But it's EQ that's not just going to help you stay there, but help you take things to the next level. So when we think a little bit more about what emotional intelligence is, and as Daniel Goleman defined it, we're talking about 5 components of it: empathy, self-awareness, self-regulation or self-management, social skills, and motivation. So if we look at it through those 5 areas, we're better able to understand how we can start putting this into practice in our own lives. And that's exactly why I'm here today. So it's great to talk about the theory, and that is the academic side of things, but it's really about how do we make this actionable? How do we start to use emotional intelligence to our advantage? And that's really all that matters. For leaders, as you continue to build and implement a new culture in this organization, as you look to grow as leaders in your career, both personally, professionally, and to add value to this organization, it's really about how do we take EQ, be able to compartmentalize it, and use it to add value, to enrich our lives, but simultaneously to enrich the lives of others. 3, having a purpose. I know many of you in the room are probably familiar with Simon Sinek. Talks about having a why, right? Really, that's what purpose is. It's understanding and knowing why you're doing what you're doing and using that to inform you. So if you're putting together any kind of plan as a leader to grow a business, you need to understand and know why you're doing what you're doing. 3 is purpose. 4, having a mission, defining success. Something that Coach John Wooden did as part of his pyramid of success. He was able to define what success would be for him. So for this business, as you think a little bit deeper about where you're trying to go, all of your strategic goals and all of what you're trying to do should tie back to that mission. You get to define success for yourself, not others, not the people on the outside, not your competitors, not what the media says, certainly, right? It's how you define success as leaders for where you want to lead and take this business. So number 4 is mission. And last, number 5, it's having those strategic goals that are going to align back with everything that you're trying to do to take this organization to the next level. And then you flip it on its head and you reverse engineer that. So the goals that you're trying to achieve, everything is going to go back, and then you're able to plan success from that, and you're able to understand your why. But having that values, having that passion are absolutely fundamental, and it's what many, many organizations and some leaders end up missing. One of the great stories on emotional intelligence that I love to tell comes from a man who many of us look at as one of the great leaders, period. I talked a little bit earlier about Coach John Wooden, and a man that maybe in some ways has passed him is Coach Mike Krzyzewski. We know him as Coach K. And similarly to Coach Wooden, it's become synonymous with leadership. Built Duke basketball from the early 1980s into the powerhouse that it is today. He's won 5 national championships and has had a tremendous run of success. We can learn so much from Coach K's story from the time he was a young boy in the south side of Chicago, attending West Point, the United States Military Academy, serving his country, and serving the players and many people that he's made for a better life. So we know Coach K today is this incredible winner, but it didn't really start out that way at Duke University. He scuffled a bit in his first couple of years. The team wasn't winning a lot. They were actually pretty mediocre. And in his third year, if you can even believe it, people were calling for him to be fired. How many of us would want to live in a world where the media was speculating of when we might lose our job? Now think about that, right? So in his third year, Duke was very much middle of the road. They had had a great recruiting class come in earlier that year, but they hadn't hit their peak yet. They hadn't had the time to gel. He was trying to instill that sense of camaraderie that we all know is what builds a winning culture, but it wasn't happening yet. And in the final game of that season, 1983, they played in the ACC basketball tournament, and they were blown out of the gym. They lost by more than 40 points. It was a humiliating loss on national TV, and the calls only grew louder for Coach K to be fired. So after the game ended, went to a local diner, and he sat down with the assistant coaching staff, and the coaches in the room, they could tell that he looked disturbed, that he looked upset. Almost seemed to have a perplexed look on his face. So trying to break up the mood, one of the assistant coaches took his glass of water, tapped it with the knife, and decided to make a toast. And after that blowout loss by more than 40 points, in which every one of those coaches was beginning to wonder about their own future of employment, the assistant coach raised his hand and he said, "Here's to a night let's soon forget." And everybody at that table looked at Coach K, and he had a very, very serious, very poignant look on his face. And he waited a second, he took a deep breath, and he then decided to raise his glass. And he looked around at each one of the coaches at the table, and what he then said was, "No. Here's to a night we'll never forget." So what can we learn from that story? It was a moment of incredible self-awareness from a great coach in the making who realized that the greatest wins come from the greatest losses. That adversity is actually our best friend in disguise. And everything that Duke basketball became from that moment on was from that big loss. He built the foundation of the best basketball program in the country on a huge loss when everything was at stake, when everything was on the line. He had the self-awareness to know in that moment that what they needed to do was to get more serious and to stare that defeat in the eye and never let it happen again. He began to adapt. And when we talk about emotional intelligence, it's impossible to not talk about adaptability. And that's where you need to have the self-awareness to know, do I stay the course or do I change? And that seminal moment, that tipping point for Duke basketball was one of those forks in the road that every business, every sports organization, every leader faces. Do I continue on believing and thinking that what I've been doing is right, especially when the results haven't been right? Or do I go back to the drawing board and look at the principles and the values? Do I look at the game plan? Do I recognize what it's going to take for me to be better and for me to change and evolve? As John F. Kennedy once said, change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past and the present are sure to miss the future. You have to know as a leader when it's time to mix things up and when it's time to adapt. And that moment for Coach K was the moment that changed everything forever for Duke basketball. And it's why they are one of the top programs in the country today. And motivation being one of the core components, it's that intrinsic motivation inside of you. It's great when we have people there to support us on the outside, but it's really from the inside that we draw that inner fire. That inner motivation that helps us wake up every morning at 6 o'clock, 5:30, and not hit the snooze button. What are we identifying in our lives as leaders that is going to make us successful and motivated and inspired every single day? As we all know, motivation alone is not going to get you there. You have to have a solid plan. You have to work hard. All of the key ingredients to success. You have to be persistent. But what I would ask you is that you be persistent with how you motivate yourself. That you have a routine every single day at the beginning of each day that inspires you, that brings the color and joy out of you, that exudes, I love what I do and I'm passionate about the mission of this organization.